Hey, good day, everybody, and welcome to your live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby, and I'm also one of your chef instructors in the courses. Thank you so much for joining me today for my office hours. This is your opportunity to ask questions, really any question that's food and cooking related, and I'll do my best to respond to it. All right. As we get started, I see that we have a number of questions already entered into the queue on the right-hand side of your page. And if you would like to add to that list, you are welcome to do so. Questions or comments are welcome. And, to do so, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a small dialog box that says Add Question Here. Go ahead and type in your question or comment, and that will make its way to me, to the queue. And then the second part of this interaction is, as you look at the individual questions that are already entered in the darker gray rectangles, in the upper right-hand corner of that of a given question, you'll see a heart-shaped icon. If you would like to see that question answered sooner than later, go ahead and click on that, and that pushes that question up in priority in the queue. But fear not, I will get to all the questions today. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the office hours. So we have the first question. Hello, Allison. To wash or not to wash mushrooms? Aha. So this sounds like an age-old question. I'm doing the garlicky mushrooms and was wondering if I wash them, would it make a difference in the cooking process? I always wash all my produce, even from my own garden. Aha. So, generally washing produce across the board is a pretty good practice. In the case of mushrooms, depending on the variety, some will absorb water more than others or quicker than others. That's probably the main thing to keep in mind, at least from my experience. And, I do wash my mushrooms, and I do a quick rinse under some running water to remove any debris that the mushrooms have grown in. And, that's about it. And yeah, I don't soak them in the water. I don't allow them to bob around in a bowl of water. So for me, the risk of water absorption is minimized, and then I use them immediately. Okay, thank you. All right, next question. How long can stock keep in the fridge and freezer? So this is a very common question, okay, regarding foods in general, refrigeration, shelf life, as well as freezer shelf life. And let me start with the second part of the question first, and that is regarding the freezer as a place to store your food. In a freezer, foods will last a really long time, and it depends on the food, depends on how it's packaged. But certainly I have forgotten things and discovered them, years later, a couple of years later, let's say. And, by and large, they're edible. Sometimes they're 100% edible. But very often items will dry a little bit around the edges, not liquids like stock, but just other foods in general. They also will shift just a little bit in flavor. And so it's going to be up to you to test it to see if it's going to be acceptable for what you want to use it for. My general recommendation for things going into the fridge would be to use them up within 6 months. And, the sooner you use it, the fresher it's going to be. But I try to keep a maximum clock of 6 months ticking for my own freezer. Now, when it comes to the refrigerator, generally speaking, foods will be safe from about 5 to 7 days. It depends again on the product. When it comes to stock specifically, animal-based stocks, I would look at 5 days and really pay attention to it. You might be able to eke out another day or two. If it's a plant-based stock, you can often easily get to 7 days, if not, a day or two or so beyond that. Our biggest concern here typically is spoilage bacteria. Okay. Now, certainly if there is a pathogen present, then that will trump the spoilage bacteria in terms of possible consequences. But for most situations, it is spoilage bacteria that's going to be the problem. And it's really just a matter of tasting the food to see if you still like it. And as I like to say, when in doubt, put it in your mouth. When it comes to animal stocks and also vegetable stocks, they will start to lose their sweetness, lose that sort of clean flavor that they started out with. And you'll notice some aroma shift, as well as often what looks like a little bloom on the surface of the liquid. Okay, and those are all signs that there's some life in there, there's some activity, and you should be extra vigilant. All right, but 5 to 7 days in the fridge, maximum 6 months in the freezer. Thank you. And another question from Christina. Can I omit an ingredient in a required recipe that I dislike or I'm allergic to? So yes, the quick answer is yes. I mean, certainly if you're allergic to it, we don't want you to subject yourself to that. We want you to enjoy the food that you're preparing, and otherwise to figure out a version of that dish that you and your family and friends can enjoy. And similarly with likes and dislikes too. One thing that I will mention is when it comes to making ingredient substitutions, please be aware that lessons are built around learning outcomes. And sometimes an ingredient substitution can significantly change the outcome of that dish such that it is no longer aligned with the intended outcome, in which case, we will ask you to redo the assignment. But most of the time you can make a substitution and the results will be just fine. If you have a specific example that you'd like to ask about, please send us a question with some ample time. Not hey, I'm making lunch in 30 minutes. Can you answer the question? But give us a little bit of time so that we can get to your question and we can troubleshoot with you. Okay. But also keep in mind that as you're making ingredient substitutions, just generally speaking, think about the function of the ingredient in the recipe as you choose a replacement. Okay, and many times a particular ingredient will have multiple functions, in which case it can be a challenge to find a single ingredient substitute. So you might need to consider 2 or 3 or sometimes more ingredients in order to get the job done. All right, all things to keep in mind. Thank you. All right, next, a couple of questions here. Number one, what is the difference between 6-month cooking program and membership basis program? And so let me answer that one first. The 6-month cooking program refers to a couple of our long courses, what we call our professional courses, which are specifically the professional cook certification and the professional plant-based certification courses. Both of those being 6 months in duration, and they mimic, generally speaking, an on-ground diploma curriculum, and hence the longer duration. Okay, and so those are structured courses that you go through. They have ample instructor support in case questions come up along the way, for example. And then membership basis program means that you're going to be paying a membership fee on a monthly basis. You do not have access to our longer programs. You've got access to our shorter lessons, and a couple of other, I'll say, introductory short courses on particular topics, conventional cooking as well as plant-based cooking, and much limited, more limited chef instructor support for the membership basis as well. Okay, so those are the fundamental differences. All right, thank you. And part two, is there any certification for membership programs? No, there is no certification associated with a membership program. Any time limit for completing the membership program? Not a time limit per se, it's just contingent on your monthly payments. Okay, and so if you decide to stop making payments, then at that point your access will stop. All right, thank you. And next question from Kathleen. Is it better to dice vegetables cold from the refrigerator or at room temperature? I got to say, Kathleen, I've never done a side-by-side comparison regarding temperature of produce when I'm cutting them. It's usually just a matter of how much leisure time I have in getting things cut. So my quick response is that it makes little to no difference. I certainly haven't noticed anything that comes to mind, but give it a try and notice if anything is significant to you, right? In which case you've got your data and you can go down the best path forward. Thank you. All right, next up from Billy. What advice do you have for someone who is interested in establishing a plant-based food truck? My first response is do so cautiously. All right. Starting a food truck of any sort is a business. It's a small business startup, idea, plan, execution, which I think requires all of the attention of any other type of food-based business. And so, my sort of overall outline, I guess, approach to this sort of a scenario would be to, encourage you to develop some breadth and depth to your skill set as well as your knowledge before you decide to, invest your resources in the business itself. In other words, you're cooking for other people. Ideally, you would be working for other people as well. In the case of a food cart, I would recommend that you work in a food cart, maybe a couple of them, to understand the logistical challenges that come with working in a small space. There are different types of menu styles that coincide with levels of equipment, in the food truck. And those are regulated by local or regional laws. And so they have to do with ventilation and other safety aspects of the food service operation. Okay. And so those are all things that you want to become acquainted with to help inform your decision, right, as to which path you want to go down in terms of the type of food you want to prepare, right? Some of them, in other words, will allow you to prepare any food on the truck itself, including raw, anything cooked, anything raw. Other times you need to use a commissary kitchen that is, off-site from your truck. And so again, those are just part of the logistical considerations that you get to consider in this bigger picture. In terms of, acquiring skills and knowledge, it's all based upon your exposure to food. And I always encourage folks to travel, to eat widely, to try out new recipes at home, understand global, regional cuisine, cook with other people, whether they are a professional chef or whether they are an established home cook that can teach you something in that area that you're interested in. And those are certainly the folks that I continue to seek out today. In order to increase my knowledge in food areas that might be thin, for example. Think about Then investigating the market, right, to see, identify any gaps. And it sounds like you may have, since you're proposing a plant-based food truck. Craft a business plan. I think a business plan is crucial. So many people in the food business don't do that, only to be surprised by some of the idiosyncrasies that are associated with the food service business, and also the expenses that quickly add up. Okay, and then also get to know your local and regional laws that relate, especially to food service operations, public health laws, for example, that would apply. Okay, it's a long list, and it's one that can certainly take some time to move through and to study, to become acquainted with, so that you're operating from a level of confidence. All right, and then investigate the equipment, right? The trucks, and anything else that you might need on board, and you'll understand the investment. Financially, emotionally, time-wise, and then you'll be set to go. All right, thank you. All right, next up, I got a question from Larry. Your thoughts and commentary on the alternative burger meats on the market. From what I can see, way too many oils in the products. Yes, so I've tried at least three of these products, sometimes at restaurants and, sometimes at food shows, which I try to get out to periodically to stay abreast with new products in our industry. And my first response is that the flavor and the mouthfeel of these products can be quite satisfying. If one is after a meat analog, I think the technology today allows us a product that can satisfy. Now, on the other hand, I'm not a particular fan of these products personally, because they generally are quite processed, and it's not my first choice for a meal. The other part of it, I think, for me, is cultural, right? One where if I'm not interested in eating an animal, then I don't want a plant-based analog that resembles an animal. I'd rather just eat a plant-based food item that stands on its own plant-based merit. Okay, so those are a few thoughts that come to mind. But I think as you point to the oils in these products, that certainly stands out in my mind as part of the often too processed product sort of attribute, I guess, or characteristics, not attribute, but characteristic that kind of pushes me away from those products. Thank you. All right, next up. Hello, Elena. I purchase delicate organic herbs in the little plastic pouches at grocery stores. I wash all my produce, including these herbs, but they sometimes get waterlogged. Should I continue to wash these delicate herbs even though they are packaged? So my quick response to packaged herbs is, if it makes you feel better to rinse them off, by all means do so, but try to do it immediately before you use it, so that it has the least amount of time to break down in any way. In terms of waterlogging, a couple of things can help. You might dab it off, in a towel, whether it's a paper towel or a cloth towel. And then also a salad spinner can be effective in removing excess water as well. Okay. And yeah, I think that answers the question. All right. Thank you. Next up from Carol. When choosing which source of acid to use in cooking vegetables, is it based only on flavor pairing, or are there other considerations? For me, it is primarily flavor, right? As we choose a source of acid, commonly it's a vinegar. Oftentimes it is a citrus fruit. It may be tamarind, or it could be kokum, some sort of a souring agent, right? Or it could be granules of citric acid, right? There are probably some other options out there. But most of these that I've mentioned have an accompanying flavor. And so you want to think about whether that goes with the dish that you're preparing or not. Now, the other concern would be the color impartation, right? Something like a balsamic vinegar, for example, or a sherry vinegar, a malt vinegar can add some dark brownish tones to the food, which you may not want. So think about the color impartation as well, right? Some are fairly neutral, champagne vinegar, for example, versus others that have very noticeable color. All right, thank you. And next up from Pamela. I'm going to buy a new chef's knife. What brands do you recommend? Aha. Let me start by saying that, when it comes to kitchen tools and equipment, while I have some expectations around quality, durability, longevity, I'm not one to be concerned too much about brand names by and large, okay? And especially when it comes to cutlery. There are so many acceptable choices on the market today that it depends on many other factors aside from brand. And so let's run through these together. And you'll need to think through how important these are to you, okay? And I guess the first one is brand name, okay? Where sometimes to the consumer, having a particular brand name in their kitchen is important. And so you get to weigh that question, okay? I think a bigger factor is really, how does the knife fit your hand? And how is it suited to the type of cooking, the type of cutting that you intend to do? All right, so let's start off with size. All right, very often when we think about a chef's knife, we make a recommendation of an 8-inch chef's knife. And I think an 8-inch chef's knife is a very good place to start for most people most of the time. It affords a pretty good balance, between being large enough to move through your food at a pretty good rate in terms of prep speed, but it's not so big that it's difficult to handle. Okay, so in other words, there are 10-inch chef's knives, there are 12-inch chef's knives. I've occasionally dealt with larger knives, but it can be challenging and certainly not necessary at home. On the other hand, there are smaller chef's knives, 7-inch, 6-inch, 5-inch chef's knives, for example. Those can be quite effective on one hand, but your prep is going to progress much slower. You're just not going to cover as much area of the cutting board and quantity of the food with each cut. So, therefore, think about the size. When starting children out in the kitchen at a very young age, I would recommend something small like a 4 or 5-inch chef's knife. But as we move into adulthood with more dexterity, then probably a larger chef's knife is going to be more suitable most of the time. Again, part of that's going to depend upon your hand size, just overall comfort. Okay. And then if you can get your hands on the knife, that would be ideal. I understand that's challenging these days with more and more cutlery stores moving exclusively online, but that feel in your hand is also very important. And generally speaking, knives are designed in an ergonomic manner that fits most people pretty comfortably. But you might find that you have a different grip, different movement of your fingers, the way your thumb wraps around the handle, that might dictate a particular design. And so you'll need to kind of work through that to determine if that's you or not. When it comes to the construction of the knife, look for what we consider to be solid construction, which generally speaking is a knife that has a tang that runs all the way through, certainly most of the way through the handle. And so in other words, it's the extension of the blade that runs into the handle, and that's going to provide the best balance and the best longevity for that very important tool in the kitchen. Okay. Some knives are sort of thicker and heavier than others in terms of their design and construction, and that's going to be a personal call. There are, generally speaking, say European style knives. Many are German made, some are French made, that are heavier, and they are correspondingly suitable for harder items like maybe a Hubbard squash, for example. And then in another category, you've got Japanese style knives that are often thinner, lighter weight, not suitable for those heavy, big, hard items, but do great on light and medium weight fruits and vegetables. And so that's going to be a stylistic call on your part. Although if you do a bunch of Hubbard squash or hard winter squashes, you might want to have a heavy bladed knife in your arsenal as well. Okay. Price wise, as you probably know, knives run from relatively inexpensive to very, very expensive. Many hundreds of dollars per knife, for example. I'll give you a reference. All right. Some years ago, Consumer Reports magazine rated their best buy the Victorinox brand chef's knife. Victorinox is the Swiss Army knife people. The knife that they produce is a stamped steel blade with a hard, sort of rubberized handle, very cheap looking. On the other hand, performs reasonably well. It's long lasting, comfortable. I have a couple of those that I use and have been using for a long time, in addition to a bunch of other knives, but that's one that comes to mind. All right. Thank you very much. All right, next up. How do I keep eggs and other proteins from sticking to my stainless steel pans? Cleanup is so frustrating and difficult that I sometimes opt for a nonstick skillet, even though it won't yield ideal results. Okay, when it comes to eggs, and I cook them in a nonstick pan. Okay, I'll say that first. But if you want to stick with a stainless steel pan, then ample fat is going to be the answer. Okay, that's the only way that I have seen eggs cooked successfully in a stainless steel pan. A thoroughly seasoned cast iron pan can work well, okay, with minimal fat added in that case. In terms of other proteins, animal proteins, for example, if you want to cook a pork chop or a chicken breast, for example, stainless steel can work quite fine. I recommend some fat, but you might take a look at the Ruby video that covers how to heat a pan. The goal is to get the heat of the pan pretty high, and that's going to some extent inhibit sticking. All right, so there's going to be a combination of things here: pan, heating, as well as a little bit of fat that's added in the case, especially of something lean like a chicken breast. Okay, so give that a try, Susan. Thank you. All right, next up, what do you look for when picking out a good lime? Is the color a factor? No yellow, for example. Sometimes I end up with a lime that's very pulpy with less juice. Yes. So when I have a chance to individually select limes, I look for a skin that is smooth. And, often if I give it just a little squeeze, I can feel that it's fairly full and juicy. But visually, the first clue is going to be a relatively smooth skin. And I have very good success choosing limes that way. The color, I mean, more green is probably more better, but a little bit of yellow is not going to be a problem. Okay, thank you. And next up from Diana. Is there a trick to peeling fresh garlic? I find it too time consuming trying to remove the peels. No, I don't think there's a trick at all. I find it to be quite time consuming as well. My technique, my method, my approach to the madness here is to put the clove on a cutting board and lay a knife over it and then whack the knife so that it crushes the clove to some extent or enough to loosen up the skin, and then the skins are more easy to peel. But it's not always as simple as that, of course, as you know. Sometimes that thin filament-like skin really wants to adhere to the cloves, and it just takes some time to remove. Not the answer you wanted to hear, but that's the best I have today. All right, next up. Sunny, how you doing today? Good to see you. Let's see. Wondering today about fresh bay leaves versus dry bay leaves. Do they vary much in their flavor properties and flavoring abilities? When a recipe calls for bay leaves, should the quantity be adjusted if using fresh leaves versus the dried leaves? So starting with the tail end of your sequence here, Sunny, I would say don't worry about adjusting the quantity, fresh versus dry. Bay leaves have a lot of flavorful oils in them, and even when they're dry, they tend to hang on to a lot of that flavor. And so I find them to be quite similar, whether dry or fresh. And then in terms of any other properties here, flavor-wise or otherwise, not really. There's no significant differences that are coming to mind. Okay, I find them to be pretty similar. All right, thanks. Bye-bye. Next up, is there a proper ratio for making a dressing, similar to how there is a proper ratio to vinegar, proper oil to vinegar ratio for making a vinaigrette? I never know the proper amount of protein, egg, mustard, mayo, etc., to add. For these other dressings, it really depends on the style of dressing or that recipe or recipe family, where these other ingredients, the egg to other items, for example, can really vary. And so it's you might be able to distill it to some ratios that work for your kitchen, especially if you're using a smaller subset of dressings, just a couple of 3 favorites that are your go-to dressings that you can easily memorize. But otherwise, I have found that it can vary enough that I don't have a ratio to share with you. All right, thank you. And next from D, regarding fruit paste, specifically using figs, I've tried several attempts and it looks nothing like the recipe video. I'm using organic Deglet figs and they're sort of gummy. Wrong kind, not dried. I need this for the balsamic potatoes. Aha. So let's take a look at some of the terminology used here. You mentioned Deglet and fig in the same breath. I'm familiar with Deglet dates, but not Deglet figs. So do double check that. But otherwise, let me, without some other troubleshooting sort of scenario details here, let me just basically say that in the case of using the dried fruit as a sweetener, as well as a flavoring component, if you want to use dates, I like to use medjool. They tend to be very sweet. If you want that sweetness intensity for the dressing for the balsamic potatoes, otherwise, of course, pick and choose the type of date or the fig, right, that you want. Otherwise, with adequate water in the blender, in my experience, I've been able to, develop a relatively smooth consistency, enough for a balsamic dressing to coat potatoes, for example. Okay, so it may be just a matter of you sort of extending the directions of the fruit paste recipe by going ahead and adding some additional liquid to thin it out just a bit so it's a little bit more even for you. And then you can use it in the next step of the production process. Thank you. And next up, hello, Sandra. I'm doing the FOK class. I want to make a curry and find a recipe that uses light coconut milk. Is that a permissible ingredient for FOK? My quick response would be yes, right? What we want to try to, minimize is going to be added oil. And then often the salt component comes to mind as well. But in terms of the fat, I think that you're addressing here, coconut milk, coconut fat, coconut cream, these are generally going to be in their natural context, which is going to be, quite fine in my book. But ultimately, it's going to be up to you and, what you think about that ingredient. Okay, thank you. And next, can fresh garlic be frozen? If so, with or without outer skin, whole clove, or minced crushed? The quick answer is yes, garlic can be frozen. And my recommendation is to go ahead and clean them up and process them to the extent that you will use them in the future. So if you prefer them in the whole clove form, leave them that way. If you like them, minced or chopped in some fashion, go ahead and process them to that extent, and then store them in containers that are small enough that you don't have to defrost a big batch of them as you work through it in the fridge, okay? Because they just they lose their freshness over a few days. So ideally, package them in smaller units for freezing. All right, thank you. And next up, I recently completed the Ruby course with Chip, okay, for plant-based cooking. Can I access all the Ruby recipe database now? By the way, love the course. Excellent, Diane. So good to hear that you're enjoying your experience with Ruby. And yes, you can access the recipes, okay? In fact, our recipe collection is open access. So please have some fun with it. All right, thank you. Next up from Katrina. What are your thoughts about cooking with birch xylitol? Is it too processed for a whole food plant-based diet? Okay, so we're talking about a sweetener here from the birch tree, birch xylitol. I've never used birch xylitol, and I generally just stick with sugar or whole leaf stevia. I try to steer clear of these other processed sweeteners. It's just my personal preference. And, is it too processed for a whole food plant-based diet? It certainly is a processed item, and the market form that I'm familiar with it available in is quite processed. It's a white powder at that point. And so it, on one hand, does not fit the general sort of expectations of a whole food diet of any sort. But, if you need a sweetener that is compatible with somebody with diabetes, for example, then you might need to consider some of the alternatives, this one being one of them. So it's really going to be up to you as to whether you want to use that or not. Okay, I don't have any real judgment call one way or the other. Thank you. So next up, while creating a recipe, how you calculate the yield versus wastage. Okay. So it sounds like a math question, a kitchen math question. So you want to weigh the product as you start out before you do any peeling or cutting or anything. Just weigh the entire product. And then after you peel it and pull out the seeds and anything else that you consider waste, you want to weigh the edible portion. Okay. And then the edible portion weight is divided by that original entire weight, which we call the AP, or as purchased weight. And that's going to give you a number that's less than 1, right? It represents a percentage. So on a calculator, you take your edible portion divided by your as purchased weight, so EP weight divided by AP weight, and then you want to multiply that number by 100, right? Or move the decimal point over 2 places to get a percentage. And that will tell you what your yield percent is, okay? Now, in terms of the waste percentage, you can do the waste percentage in 2 ways. The waste percentage is calculated by taking 100% minus your yield percent. That equals waste percent, right? Because yield percent plus waste percent should equal 100. All right. Now, the other way to do that is to weigh your waste product. So you have a waste weight, then you divide that by your AP weight, and then you'll get that number that you need to multiply by 100 or otherwise move the decimal point over 2 places to get a percentage. Okay, so there's your kitchen math lesson for the day. Thank you. And next up, what kind of chilies are best and most common in a Mexican mole? Okay, so, it depends on the mole. There are many different kinds of moles. And it depends on the style. So take a look at, whatever recipe, whatever regional styles you're looking at, and go from there. Okay. I mean, very often there are multiple chilies that are being used, and you can get that specific answer for that preparation. All right. Thank you. Next up, I tried the basic pasta dough recipe on Ruby with 1 cup all-purpose flour and 2 large eggs. Once I rolled the dough through the pasta machine, every second pasta was stuck together. I had to separate it by hand. How come this happens? That is because the moisture content is a little bit high. Okay. And so as you put it through the cutting rollers, the dough immediately fuses together again. And so as you work with the dough, just cut back on the dry to wet ratio. Okay. You can either cut back on liquid or add more flour, and then, work that dough. Do it in small increments. Make your changes in small increments, because that's probably all that's needed. And then, as you get it to that balance, you should be able to push it through, and it'll cut nicely. All right. Thank you. Okay. So next question, where do you see Culinary RX going in the future? Wow. That's an interesting question. Sounds like it might be directed toward a plant-based doctor here, but let me see if I can come up with something to answer your question. When it comes to Culinary RX, when I hear that, I think about food as medicine, right? This idea of food as medicine. And I think, within the field of medicine, that the spotlight is increasing, right, on food as being central to get good health, both in preventing illness as well as healing from illness. And we're seeing that shift at the medical school level, right, with more schools interested in incorporating cooking classes or otherwise classes around food and health for medical students. And I know up until very recently, on average, right, the number of hours that med school students get around cooking and food is in the single digits throughout their entire med school curriculum. So we have a long way to go, but that's where I think it's going based upon the signals out there. Thank you. All right, next up, what, if any, cool, interesting stories have you heard that Ruby grads are doing with their training, whether it be in a professional or personal setting? Yeah, I'm not coming up with particular names and faces right now, but generally speaking, we have graduates that are doing work in the food blogging space, folks that are focusing on food photography in some way, whether it's incorporated with their blog or website work that they're doing, or whether it's freelance photography for others. There are certainly folks that I have heard from over the years that have started small-scale catering businesses, focusing on some niche of interest, whether it's desserts or whether it's savory food, whether it's quick grab-and-go style food or more elaborate plated meals. So those are some ideas, some examples that come to mind of stories that we have heard here at Ruby over the last few years. Thanks. All right, next up from Michelle. When a recipe calls for thyme, for example, 1 teaspoon of thyme, what are they asking for? A teaspoon of fresh thyme, dried, powdered? What's the assumption? I'm making the practice dish braised red cabbage with beans. Aha. So my quick answer is, I don't know. Ideally, the recipe would be written specifying the type of ingredient, fresh, dried, or otherwise. Otherwise, it might be kind of up to you or up to me, right, if I were cooking that same recipe, to kind of go with what I have in my inventory. I'll say that, with something like thyme, while there certainly is a difference in volume, right, fresh to dry. But if you're using something as small as a teaspoon, you might add half a teaspoon, and then you can test the recipe, the flavor intensity, and then you can always add more. Okay, that would be my approach. And then take notes. As I often mention, I'm a fan of taking notes in the kitchen because these sorts of things come up, these questions that I have, and then I have the answer for my particular kitchen, my particular preference around the food preparation. Okay, but that's my answer for that sort of ambiguity in recipes. Thank you. And next, what is the trick to making a veggie burger that is not mushy or that doesn't fall apart? How do you get it firm enough to get a nice mouthfeel with real bites? Okay, so this is an interesting question, right? One where when we describe this expectation, right, around a vegetable burger, very often we have in mind that old meat-based patty that we used to eat, right? Where meat proteins tend to become firm, and those patties give us this satisfying mouthfeel from the chewability. Now, plant-based burgers are a different animal, all right, so to speak. But or I should say, therefore, we should expect some differences, okay, in the results. I've had many satisfying vegetable-based burgers, but none of them felt in my palate, in my mouth, exactly like a plant-based burger. Okay, but some things to keep in mind as we construct a plant-based patty, and that is to control the degree of cooking of some of those firmer ingredients, okay, whether it is cauliflower or something else. Now, we often have something like a well-cooked russet potato as a binder, okay, because they get nice and sticky and hold the peas and the corn and the cauliflower and the diced carrots all together nicely in that patty form. But that well-cooked russet potato, right, much akin to mashed potato, just isn't going to firm up anything like a meat-based patty. And so I think it's important to shift our expectations around that overall feel of a plant-based patty. Now, we can add some things to the exterior of the patty, such as poppy seeds or sesame seeds, as we heat up and brown that patty. And those additions serve to provide a little bit of resistance to the tooth, a little bit of texture while we're chewing, but still in a plant-based sort of way. Okay, so I don't again think that we're going to replicate a animal-based patty in more simple whole food home cooking styles. Okay, and I don't want to get into introducing a bunch of high technology ingredients to get us there. Okay, I think that defeats the purpose. Okay, thank you, Carol. All right, next up from Steve. First, I must know about that cool red face you are wearing on your shirt. Awesome stuff. Yeah, so this is a hand-carved, wooden, it's a bolo tie, right? But it's from the Ainu community in Hokkaido in northern Japan. All right. Also, do you have an opinion on glass versus plastic containers for storing foods in the fridge? Will plastic tend to hold on to flavors and odors? So, my quick response is that I use both here at home. And I think just because I ended up with both in the cupboard, that's probably the simplest answer that I have. Now, in terms of odors, I haven't noticed that plastic that we have, probably like today's plastic technology, I don't see that holding on to odors, at least not in the style of cooking that we do here at home. So yeah, I don't have a strong preference either way. I don't try to store foods for a real long time. Maybe that's part of my approach as well, Steve. But yeah, I don't see any problems with either one of them. I'm thinking, but nothing comes to mind. All right, thank you. Next up, as my style in cooking these wonderful dishes develops, I wonder how to enhance the flavor. I find many dishes bland. I do use herbs and spices. Any suggestions would be helpful. Okay, Barbara, and for many of us out there, right, that are developing our cooking skills, our knowledge around food handling, the enhancement of flavor is going to be very important. And I think using dry heat cooking methods is a place to start, okay, where we can impart some browning, some caramelization, and that develops a nice layer of flavor, whether it's grilling or deep frying or sauteing or roasting, for example. And then, beyond that, we can think about the other ingredients that we have. For example, shallots or onions can be sweated to bring out sweetness. These two can be caramelized very commonly as well, for some color and some other more complex notes. But sweating as a technique is nice to shift sometimes savory and harsh flavors into a sweet profile, which can enhance a dish. And then bringing in additional ingredients can also bring some interest to a particular dish. So you might have a component from the allium grouping, onions and garlic and shallots and chives, these sorts of ingredients. And then you might bring in carrots, which bring in a different type of sweetness, a different type of astringency. And you mentioned, let's see, herbs, right? And spices. When it comes to spices, keep on experimenting. Very commonly we will bloom spices in a little bit of oil in order to bring out the aroma. Aroma equals flavor. And then we incorporate that into the other ingredients in the dish. And that oil carries that flavor throughout the dish. And that's a very nice way to incorporate the flavor of spices. Okay. And also think about other flavorful ingredients, in the pickle or condiment category, if you don't mind the accompanying salt, which is usually a part of those ingredients. So, you might consider Indian pickles. If you go to an Indian grocery store, you'll see a super duper array of pickles. And not only can they be enjoyed as a pickle on the side of your plate, but also incorporated as a fun ingredient in so many preparations. For example, I will incorporate Indian pickles into hummus. And so then, I've got 100 ways to make hummus. And similarly, olives and other items can be incorporated into soups and stews and rice preparations, a pilaf or fried rice, for example, to bring some interest to the palate. All right, so give those a try and see if some of those satisfy you. Thank you. All right, next up. Hello, Carmen. How to determine the function of the different ingredients in a recipe. How you can tell what the function is, thinking of traditional recipes. So, I think it's, if we were investigating together a recipe, I think answering this interesting question would be a lot easier. But let me just generally say that, take a look at a particular ingredient and with your eyes, first of all, take a look at what it's doing, in the recipe. Is it sticky, and is it holding things together as a binder? Is it hard and adding a textural element on the palate? Is it pungent in nature, in its flavor or aroma, and therefore contributing primarily to flavor or aroma? Something like as I mentioned a few minutes ago, a russet potato that's well cooked and incorporated into a vegetable patty, has a very particular binding effect, right? Just as an example. But, in this way, I would look at a particular ingredient and just try to think about the different ways that I experience it, okay? On the palate, as well as, in terms of flavor and taste, as well as the texture. And then that should give you some clues as to the function of that item. Okay. Now, when it comes to conventional baking, okay, and we have the role of, let's say, eggs, right, or the role of sugar, granulated sugar, or the role of fluid dairy products like milk, those interactions can be much more complex because we often can't see exactly what those ingredients are doing in that baked good, whether it's a loaf of bread or a cookie or a croissant or something else, in which case it becomes necessary to study a book that's written about the topic, because often it's a food scientist that has, kind of jumped into the details with a microscope and has discovered how these ingredients function at a very micro level. Okay, so consider books as well for study. All right, thank you, Carmen. And let's see, next up from Christine. I'm on a limited income. Can I take the course without a time limit for getting projects done so I can do them as I can afford them? I thought I saw a sidebar about this, but can't locate it now. Christine, I'm going to have you please reach out to student support, where our team there can better address your question. All right, thank you. And next up from Sammy, what are the main points to be considered in menu engineering? What is the range, in your opinion, for the food cost? Okay, so interesting business question here. What's the main points? Well, let me maybe address your second question first. What's the range, in your opinion, for food costs? So, it really depends on the operation. Okay. As a starting point, as we theoretically talk about this topic of kitchen management, we often, use references of a food cost of about 20%. But it can really vary quite a bit depending on the operation, your labor cost, which can vary regionally, and the complexity of the menu. Okay, the style of the menu, the type of ingredients that are being used, certainly, if we're talking about menu engineering, we're really talking about overall food cost, right? Keeping in mind that the food cost of any given menu item, any given recipe, right, compared to the next one can vary tremendously. Okay, from the single digits. Well over 50% food cost on a given recipe item. Okay, but as far as an overall food cost target goes, it's very often, right, 20 or so percent. But again, can vary quite a bit depending on those details that I mentioned, those variables that I mentioned a moment ago. Main points to be considered in menu engineering. Well, I think we need to pay attention to how individual dishes plug into the overall sort of function of the menu financially, right? So that means that we're looking at individual recipe food costs. We're also looking at the number of those dishes that we might sell, okay, on a daily basis or a weekly basis, for example, as we determine a time period that we're going to investigate from a management standpoint, okay? Because, we might have, for example, a dish that has a very low food cost, which is favorable, but we sell very few of those dishes, okay? So that dish, therefore, does not benefit the business very much from a menu engineering standpoint, okay? I'll give you another example. We might have a recipe that has a relatively high food cost percentage. Let's say it's a 40% food cost item. And it's a very popular item. We sell many, many of these examples throughout a day. That might sound exciting because we're selling a lot of them, but if it's an expensive item from a food cost standpoint, it's not favorable for the business. So we need to then think about how we can shift the consumer's preference to buy certain things. Okay, and we can do that by some other means. And one is menu layout itself and how we might position things on a menu. It could be font size. It could be bringing more or less attention to it by using color, for example. But those are a couple of things to keep in mind. Okay, there are certainly websites that you can find that will drill down much deeper into menu engineering, a very important topic for anyone that is looking at a business of some sort around selling food. All right, thank you. All right, next up, when baking tofu for the assignment task activity, is it okay if I use a silicone mat instead of parchment paper or spray oil? Absolutely, yes. In fact, it's my personal preference to use a silicone mat because they get very hot and they often produce some very nice browning on on that bottom side of the big slice of tofu. That's what I'm envisioning right now anyway. So yeah, definitely check out a silicone mat. Thank you. Next up from Patricia, the Greek pita bread recipe on Ruby. Can you talk about the consistency? It cautions us about adding extra flour and kneading about 8 minutes until firm. Can you talk about desired consistency, please? Have made it twice, but think I could make it better. Okay, so the Greek pita recipe, if I recall, is a pretty common pita recipe. A lot of variations out there, but this is a fairly common sort of an approach. It recommends kneading, I think, several minutes, 5 to 8 minutes or so, and also not to add too much flour. That's going to be true of any of these flatbreads, any bread dough really, because the addition of too much flour is going to toughen the dough, right, as it skews the dry to moist ratio. Okay, so you want to work with a dough that maintains a lot of elasticity, a lot of moisture, and if you need to, consider using a bench scraper as a tool to help you move it around, to pull it off the table and fold it over to knead. Okay, and that way you can avoid continually adding flour. All right, and this translates to a finished product that's going to be it's going to retain more moisture. It's going to be just a little bit more tender, a little bit more fluffy on the palate, and probably more enjoyable to eat as well at that point. As far as kneading goes, visually, we want to work that dough as we develop the gluten in that wheat flour, that wheat dough, but not to the point where the dough starts to tear. All right, so the guideline would be to knead the dough until it's smooth, and we're just very simply looking for a smooth surface on that ball of dough. If you start to see some signs of tearing, then it's time to stop. Okay. Let it rest. Maybe you're letting it ferment at that point, depending on what stage you're at, and then you'll move on after setting the dough aside for a while. But those are just a couple of quick little tips to keep in mind, Patricia. Try to maintain as much moisture as you can, and then don't overwork the dough. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Valentina. I'm having so much fun with the plant-based course. Excellent. Number one, when pan frying the tempeh, which way is better, cut side down or standing up? My quick response here is to say that to put the cut side down, the larger flat side, so that you can develop more browning and more flavor as that sits against the pan. Okay. And number two, my corn tortilla dough is crumbly and very hard once cooked. What am I doing wrong? Okay, so this sounds like a moisture content issue with the masa. Okay, and so very simply add more water, and then knead that into the dough, and you want that water content to be such that the dough is not sticky. Okay, number one. And if you take a sample and you press it right in your tortilla press, you should be able to peel it off. Use a plastic liner, such as a large Ziploc bag with 3 edges cut off so that it folds out into one big sheet, and so you can line your press with it. Okay. And you should be able to peel it off of that plastic so that it comes off cleanly, but is as moist as you can get it. Okay. And then when you go to cook it, put it on I want to say a moderately hot pan, and you want to cook it about maybe a third of the way through on one side, flip it over, cook it a third of the way through. So there's still a little bit of rawness in the middle. And then, I mean, ideally, if you have an open fire, you would then place the tortilla over the open fire in order to finish cooking and to puff up, right? As that remaining moisture in the center turns to steam, it's going to cause it to puff up. And then you've got the perfect tortilla, okay? If you don't have access to an open fire, then on your hot pan, cook it 50% through, flip it over and cook it 50% through to finish off, and then pull it off. And so try not to overcook it, because overcooking is going to dry it out. Then you have a tough tortilla. Okay. And then just a note for those of you that have an electric, like a pancake griddle, just something like a $25 pancake griddle that you can get at Target. Those work really well for tortillas, and you can control the heat and all that jazz. All right. So just another thing to keep in mind. Thank you. All right. Next up from Elena. With the pandemic, I'm rarely going to the grocery store and having local produce delivered every week. Some weeks you get what you get. Can I substitute onions for shallots, for example, on graded tasks? Yes. I would say, onions and shallots, no problem at all for substitution. That's going to be an easy one. But as I mentioned earlier, if the substitution changes the outcome of the dish significantly, such that it it moves away from the intended learning outcome, then we got some talking to do. Okay. In which case, give us a shout beforehand and we can help troubleshoot together. All right. Thank you. Upon returning from the grocery store, what is the best, most effective way to clean produce? I'm trying to think of this article that I referenced some time ago when a similar question came up, and I think it has to do with vinegar and water, and a little bit of elbow grease as well. But you can look that up online. I think that's probably the simplest and most natural way to clean produce, but a combination of vinegar and water and a little bit of elbow grease, just to lightly rub it, rinse it, and then set it off to dry. All right, thanks. Okay, next up. I've struggled with a recipe for whole food plant-based no oil lemon cupcakes. Tried 3 different flours, whole almond, oat, and wheat flour, but it's still spongy. The sweetener is maple syrup. Should I try dry date sugar instead to get it to be less spongy? Leslie, it's really going to be necessary to see the recipe to look at ratios and specifically what's being used. Okay. So if you wanted to investigate this together, please reach out via support@ruby.com and send the recipe my way. All right. Thank you. And next up, thanks again for all your open office hours. You're very welcome, Rose. I'm making a raw food dish in my course, and I'm not clear if maple syrup is considered raw. I know it's extracted using heat. So what are your thoughts? Maple syrup, like so many of our sweeteners that come from sap, is that you've got this watery substance that's harvested from the tree, from the blossom, in some way, and then it is reduced to thicken up, and it's reduced over heat, so it's simmered for some period of time. And so maple syrup is a cooked food, and so at least in my raw food book, I would not consider it to be raw, but I'll leave that up to you. Okay. How much you want to stick to those rules or not. Okay, I won't tell anybody. All right, thank you. All right, next up, how can we retain color while using agar-agar, like say the bright color of strawberry puree or pea puree? How to use soy lecithin? Does it always need fat or sugar to form or to form a foam? It could be either way here. Like for green juice. Okay, what are the rules? All right, so when it comes to retaining color, So in an agar preparation, so what I'm envisioning is that if you're using something like strawberry or pea puree and you cook it together, that the color shifts, right? It either gets darker or it bleeds in some fashion. And as far as a natural product goes, I mean, that's what you're going to get. Any preparations that I've seen that are set with agar and they're bright in color, they have the addition of a synthetic food coloring. Okay, so that's certainly a choice as well. The second part of your question regarding soy lecithin. How to use soy lecithin. And so basically you just incorporate it into whatever liquid that you want it to go into. And the ratio is going to be most important. All right. So if it's going into a juice, using green juice as an example, the ratio is in the neighborhood of a half percent, so 0.5% by weight. So 0.5% of the liquid by weight, and upwards of about 1%. So there's a range that you can play with depending on the desired results. And if we're talking about a foam usually ranges between 0.25%, so 0.25% of lecithin by weight of liquid, and then you can increase that to upwards of about 1%, depending on the desired results. Okay, and what's the rule? In terms of a foam, if that's the sort of presentation you're working with, present it as soon as you can. So basically, a foam should be created and then served immediately, because the bubbles start to break immediately, and you'll lose volume in your foam. And let's see, otherwise, as far as other details go, you might take a look online. There are many resources that touch upon this topic, and then certainly when you buy a container of soy lecithin, there'll be some directions that you can follow as well. All right, thank you. All right, next question. What's the correct way to prepare mushrooms? Should you peel the skin off, wash them, wipe them with a damp cloth, leave the stem on, take the stem off? My friends all prepare them differently. What should we be doing? Probably what your friends are doing are all correct. That's my hunch, okay? There's more than one way to skin a cat, and more than one way to handle a mushroom. I certainly don't bother peeling them, only because it seems like an extra step, and I'd rather just eat the entire mushroom. I will very often scoop out the black gills of a portobello, only because they will turn the dish quite dingy, speckled black colored. And I'd like to avoid that. When it comes to stems, if the stem is tender, I'm happy to eat it. When it comes to, for example, a shiitake stem, they tend to be very, very fibrous. And I will trim those off. I will use the caps in cooking, but I will reserve the stems for stock. And then I will strain those out and discard them after the stock is produced. But the stems contain a lot of flavor, so I don't want to throw them away. But otherwise, most stems that I can think of, I'm happy to eat. Okay. Washing them, I do. And I generally use running water, cold running water, and then I will cook the mushrooms or process them immediately before they discolor or do something else. Avoid soaking them in water, because many varieties will soak up the water and become kind of waterlogged, which is not going to be good for the next step of cooking. Okay. And I think that answers your questions. Thank you. And let's see, next up from Isabella. Is a cloudy stock still usable? And if so, what can I use it for? Yeah, you bet. Any sort of a stock is going to be usable in some application or another. And basically, you can use a cloudy stock where clarity is not important. Okay, so it can go into a pureed soup, a cream of soup, or it really any other application where the clarity is just not an important point. Okay, thank you. And the next question: when I cook chicken marsala, I use less than a cup. How do you recommend to use the rest of the bottle? Okay, since the marsala can stay open only up to a few days, is it okay to use the marsala for more sauce, 3/4 quart, and keep it frozen? Well, yes. Okay, so my first suggestion was going to be drink it, enjoy it. But let's see, other ways to use marsala. So let me first address in parentheses here, since marsala can stay open only up to a few days. Marsala is a fortified wine, and it is one of many. Port and Madeira are other examples. And fortified wines have the addition of brandy added to them in order to make them more shelf stable. Okay. And because of this, they will last for a relatively long time, more than just a few days, especially if they're kept, in the refrigerator, in a temperature stable environment, out of direct sunlight. They can last for many weeks potentially. Okay, so you can buy yourself time in the fridge, but certainly if you wanted to make a sauce and freeze it, you could do that as well. That's not a problem. All right, thank you. And next up, I'd love to hear about Ayurveda, vegetarian, maybe some chutney. Okay, perhaps your choice of olive oil. Okay. So here is where I'm going to direct you to a couple of archived live events on Ayurveda. And, one is an introduction to some of the principles of Ayurveda. And then the second one drills down to, applying Ayurveda to cooking, at least as an introductory step. Okay. And Patrick, our producer, has just posted those for you, so you can take a look at those, please. And I think it's important, before we jump into chutney, for example, to understand what Ayurveda is and what Ayurvedic cooking is and how that can apply to you specifically, because it is individualized. Okay. So it's going to be important to take a look at the principles first. All right. And regarding olive oil, I don't get real finicky about olive oil. I think we probably have something in the kitchen from the local grocery store that says extra virgin olive oil on it. I'm just trusting the label. So, yeah, if you're more picky about olive oil, then, you might talk to somebody at a specialty food store that carries olive oil, to learn as much as you can about particular producers, and then taste them, and then choose something that you prefer. Olive oils come in many different flavor styles, from peppery and astringent to smooth and mellow and fruity, depending on the maturity of the fruit, as well as the terroir, just where that product comes from. And so it's going to be best to think about how you will use the olive oil, the types of foods it might be paired with when you choose the particular product. All right, thank you. And next up, what is your opinion on making smoothies? I've heard conflicting whole food plant-based experts suggest them as healthy versus say they're not good for us. Right now, they've been a great way for my husband and me to enjoy fruits and veggies. Okay. So, the concern on one hand with pureed food, blended food like a smoothie, or, even juices, right, is that we will digest those items relatively quickly when compared to their unprocessed counterparts, okay, where our body has to do more work to break down the food and to digest it. And so some consumers find it easy to drink too much volume of a smoothie, which, depending on the ingredients in the smoothie, can add additional calories, or additional sugars to the body that are unnecessary. And those are a couple of areas of concern sometimes, right? So we can gain weight, we can get fat on smoothies. We can also have a lot of sugar, right, in our bodies on smoothies, possibly, okay, depending on the ingredients that are being used. Now, also, if smoothies are consumed as an addition to your daily meal regimen, that is also potentially problematic, where they can, again, be a source of additional calories. If a smoothie replaces a meal, then I think we're probably okay, right? So it just depends on how we use the smoothie and the ingredients that go into it more than anything. Thank you. All right, next up. Once I finished my 6-month cooking program and I had my certification, is the Ruby certification been recognized by well-known hotels around the world, or chefs, or I still need to do other training programs to be recognized? Well, so I'll begin by saying that we have many of our full programs that have recognition from the ACF, the American Culinary Federation, as well as WACS, WACS, the World Association of Chefs Societies, I think is what that acronym stands for. And as such, right, it I think gets some recognition on a resume, but like any other situation, right, any other I'll say culinary graduation, situation, or mention on a resume, that we often have other things that we've done that complement that, and sometimes it's cooking experience, sometimes it's education in many other areas, including other culinary areas, that all form an image, right, of you, the applicant, that is more or less favorable against another applicant. All right. And then, of course, once we have a chance to interview with the potential hiring institution or organization, then it's up to us to put on a smile and to answer questions, thoroughly and honestly and authentically, so that the other party can judge us as a person that they may want to have on their team, right? I mean, ultimately, it's all about teamwork and chemistry and getting along with one another. And then, of course, once we get the job, then it's up to us to work hard and to cooperate and exercise all those other soft skills, those interpersonal skills, as we produce food. Okay, and so those are the sort of scenarios that I think about, for anyone who is looking for employment, with a Ruby certificate. All right, thank you. All right, next up, what is the shelf of aquava? If refrigerated, can it be frozen? If so, what's the shelf life if frozen? So aquava, I'm not sure what aquava is. You have it capitalized. Is this a brand name of a beverage? Yeah, I'm not. Perhaps aquafaba. Yes. Let me just go with that. Aquafaba. So shelf life of aquafaba, right, which is made from bean water. And beans are a relatively sort of like highly perishable item. And, I would say it depends on your refrigerator and how cold it is and where it's placed in the refrigerator. But I would be definitely checking the aroma and the flavor on aquafaba, after 3 or 4 days. Okay. And then just take it day by day from there. All right. And then, can it be frozen? The aquafaba itself in its aqua form, its liquid form, can be frozen. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, try to use up frozen things within 6 months or so. And sooner the better in terms of maintaining maximum freshness. Okay. And we have another question here. If a steel wool pad is the only way I can clean my stainless steel fry pan after no oil sauteing, is the pan probably damaged? So my quick answer is no. After we scrub a stainless steel pan, it is not damaged. I think, Suzanne, probably what you're envisioning are the scratches on the surface of the pan, which are quite fine. Okay. Let me add a couple of thoughts here. Steel wool. I guess it depends on the type of steel wool pad you're talking about here, but they can be fine, right? But also consider using some of the 3M scrub pad products. So they go by the brand name of Scotch Brite, and a couple of them that I'll mention here are the I think it's a blue colored sponge. I might get my colors mixed up here, but one of them is blue. It's kind of a medium weight in terms of coarseness scrub pad, which is pretty good for most jobs on stainless steel. If it's something that's really persnickety, then there is a green and yellow scrub pad. The green side is the coarse scrub side. The yellow is the softer sponge side. That green colored scrubby is pretty tough, and it will leave some scratches, some very, very shallow scratches, but certainly doesn't damage the stainless steel pan. If anything, it's just a sign that you've been cooking. All right. But one of the advantages of stainless steel is that it's very durable, and that after scrubbing, it's still going to give you many, many, many years of service. All right. Thank you. Next question. I have a recipe for crispy baked tofu, coating with arrowroot, dip in plant-based milk, then coat with breadcrumb mix. Okay, that's a standard breading procedure. The breadcrumb mix calls for addition of olive oil. I'm wondering if you have a substitution for the oil. Okie doke. Just try omitting the oil and see what the results are. I'm not sure what the function is exactly as I think through this. Now, if anything, it might be desirable for the milk stage to be a little bit thicker, okay, for the crumbs to adhere to. All right. So in which case you could try blending some, say, flax seeds, in with the milk and letting that hydrate so it lightly gels up. And then the crumbs will adhere to those nicely. Okay. But otherwise, omit the oil and see how it goes. All right. Thank you. This is one of those questions where, we wonder what the function of the oil is, right? And I don't know. So we'll just omit it. All right. All right. Next up, I'm making this course with FOK. I'm taking this course with FOK and have eliminated oils from my cooking. I don't like cooking with onions anymore because they are bitter without oil. with dry sauteing veg broth saute. Okay. What are suggestions for dealing with bitterness in onions? So, one approach is to add a sweetener, okay, to balance some of the bitterness, okay? Um, another thought here, Leslie, is to drop the heat of the pan and more gently brown the onion. So we still have a chance here to coax out the sweetness of the onion. So I think that dropping the heat and extending the cooking time is going to be the answer here. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to pull out more sweetness from that natural transformation process of the onions. Okay, and so the bitterness goes away, and we have a base flavor of mild onion, and then sweetness comes forward. All right, so give that a try. Thank you. Can you recommend any brands of whole wheat dried pasta? Yes. Probably hands down, my favorite dried pasta brand is Rustichella d'Abruzzo. And I think Patrick is going to post a link to their website. And you want to drill down to the consumer products side. And they have some options for you to look at, but you'll find a section that features some whole wheat pasta as well. Thank you. Next up, is there a way to cut the bitterness in tahini? I've used citrus, vinegar, sweetener. If this doesn't work, should I just use less tahini? Yeah, what comes to mind for me is to add a sweetener to balance the bitterness, okay? And if that has been unsatisfactory for you, then perhaps less tahini is an answer, okay? Or otherwise, bolster the other flavors in whatever you're making so that they compete more with the bitterness from the tahini, all right? So, as we add something like sweetness to balance bitterness, it's not that sweetness cancels out bitterness and bitterness goes away. It's that it competes with that taste so that that bitter taste isn't quite so obvious. Okay, so it doesn't go away, but it becomes less obvious. And so we need to find a way to do that by adding other ingredients that have a prominent flavor that we like. Okay, if you don't want to decrease the tahini. All right, but that's of course an option for you. All right, thank you. Next up, does the Maillard reaction that happens in fried food also happen if it is in an air fryer? So yes, it can occur in an air fryer. So if I'm cutting sweets and deep frying them, is that Maillard? But if I am using an air fryer, it becomes caramelizing, slightly confusing. Sorry. So the Maillard reaction requires the proteins to be a part of that interaction. So there's going to be some sugar and some protein, some carbohydrates and some protein that are part of that. Whereas, so I guess strictly speaking, when we talk about caramelization, it's working just on the carbohydrates, the sugars that are present. Okay. I will also add, okay, that when we use the word caramelization in cooking, we often use it as a sort of a blanket term, broadly speaking, for browning. Okay, and often there's some Maillard activity going on, but there may not be when we use the term caramelizing. It's just a sort of a daily usage term that's come to be. But also keep in mind that, when the Maillard reaction is occurring, there's often caramelization that is occurring as well with the simple carbohydrates or the simple sugars that are present. Okay, so it's not nearly as simple as we make it out to be with a couple of 3 sentences. Okay, it is a bit confusing, but it's all happening. All right, thank you. All right, next up, what's the best way to cook broccoli at 3 different temperatures? Um, well, what comes to mind, when I hear your question is this idea of using the submersion technique, all right, and our practice activity around blanching, parboiling, and then fully cooking broccoli. And this method can be applied to other vegetables as well. This principle can be used with steaming as well. And basically, it's a matter of cooking broccoli, at differing time sort of intervals, or otherwise to different degrees of doneness. And then you can think about how you might want to use a firm textured broccoli versus one that has moderately firm texture to one that's much softer to the bite. Okay. And you might bind it with a cheese sauce. You might add it to a soup. You might use it as is to dip into hummus, right? Depending on the firmness of that finished product. All right, thank you. Let's see, next up. Hooray for saying we don't need to make plant-based meat substitutes and just enjoy the plants. Yeah, you bet. I mean, why not? All right, but at the same time, I understand there's a transition phase that looks different for each person, and so I certainly respect, right, that if a person wants to reach for these animal sort of product lookalikes in a plant-based form, that's fine. There's certainly a lot of those products on the market because there is a demand. But at the same time, if a person wants to just really embrace plants, then forget about it, right? Just push the animals to the side and let them be. All right. Thank you. Could you please let me know more about the professional cooking course and if I could be able to do it in 6 months? Is it okay to talk a bit more than what it said on the main page of the professional course? Yes. So the 2 pro courses, okay, in this case, we're referring to the professional cooking course, the pro cook course. They're intended to be finished in 6 months. It is a busy 6 months. You'll be in it each week, or ideally you would be. And, depending on the extent of practice you want to do, you're probably in it for 5 to 10 hours a week for 6 months. So it's a good time commitment, and one that really should be tackled on a week-to-week basis. Because as you can imagine, if you take 2 or 3 or 4 weeks off, then all of that starts to pile up, and it becomes very difficult to catch up. So keep that in mind as you embark on one of our 6-month certificate courses. It certainly is possible otherwise to finish in that period of time. And the 6-month Pro Cook course is basically it mimics an on-ground certificate course. Many of these are 6 months or so in duration, and that was the original motivation for this course. And so you're going to hit upon all those fundamental categories of food handling, and starting out with sanitation and knife skills and cooking methods and sauces and secondary handling procedures and so on and so forth. And especially if one is able to work through all of the practice recipes that are part of that course, I think you come out of that experience with a nice foundation, right, in terms of knowledge and basic skills that have been introduced. Now, beyond that, it is going to be up to you to deepen your knowledge and to hone those skills, either through more cooking at home or through work on the job in a professional setting. Okay, but I think that it could, certainly prepare you, as a similar course would at an on-ground cooking school. Okay, thank you. Next, when cooking whole food, plant-based, do you ever find you need to make an exception to make a dish just right? And if so, what exceptions do you allow yourself as a chef? So when you say exceptions, Sarah, I'm not sure just what you mean, but I'll make an assumption or two here. Okay, so first of all, I'll assume that you're not saying I'm going to sneak a pork chop in there, okay, to make it taste super savory, but instead maybe you're saying I'm going to use some sort of a processed ingredient, rather than a whole food ingredient, which is absolutely the case, right? When we talk about whole food cooking, whole food plant-based cooking, it's certainly an ideal. And depending on how strictly you want to identify, right, the things you do around that definition, it's going to be up to you. But it can be very difficult, really, to strictly speaking, deal with only whole foods. So, we grind them, we blend them, we make grains into flours, and so on and so forth. So there's, processing that happens to some extent or another. Okay, and I'm completely fine with all of that. Now, refined foods, again, you get to draw the line in the sand as it's going to be convenient and meaningful for you. Do I ever use refined foods? Yeah, sure. We have refined cooking oil in the kitchen for saute work. And there are probably some other things as well. I imagine we probably have some granulated sugar that's white in color, so it's been refined. But we also have palm sugar and jaggery and black whole sugar from Japan, and a couple of other examples. There's certainly exceptions that come up, but and we have to allow exceptions in this world. Otherwise, cooking becomes a chore. And one of our goals at Ruby is to see that cooking is joyful. And to do that, you need to set your own boundaries, set your own rules, be comfortable in breaking them once in a while. Eat foods that make you happy and keep you healthy in moderation, in great variety, for best results. All right. Thank you. All right. Good day. What do we got here? I just started the professional cook certification course. Wonderful. Do you have any tips and advice for newbies? Wow, that's a wide open question. So I would first of all say stay on pace. Okay, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, if you slip, off the schedule, it becomes difficult to catch up. Do as many of the practice recipes as you can in order to understand cooking methods or sauce preparation or whatever the topic is that you're investigating. And then, if you have questions, reach out. Okay, use the Q&A function on the given task. And then ask a question as it pertains to that task information, and use your resources to deepen your knowledge and to broaden your skill set. And also focus on the methods and the techniques of cooking and the recipes secondarily. Okay, one thing that we emphasize at Ruby is that the methods and the techniques learned will allow you to cook most any cuisine, or at least you'll understand the basics of most any cuisine in any setting around the world. That's certainly been, my experience. And don't be bound by recipes. Recipes are merely a suggestion. And once you understand all of these methods and techniques, then you will have control over the recipe, and you will be able to bend it and shape it to do what you want to do for your particular setting. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so don't be afraid to change things. All right, keeping in mind, right, that when it comes to assignments, that we need to stay in accordance with the desired learning outcome for that assignment. But otherwise, feel free to experiment and to continue your learning journey in all different directions. Okay, thank you very much. Great question. And next up, hola Maria. Do stainless steel pans need to be seasoned? No, they don't. I think I ruined mine when I first tried to use it. It got stained, looks bad. Aha. So what you need is one of those Scotch Brite scrub pads. Get the green one and then apply a lot of elbow grease. And that's going to get your stainless steel pan shiny again. Okay. I've had to do that many times on the inside as well as the outside, but it'll come back again, come back to life. Okay. Enjoy. And next up from Peggy, I am enrolled in the FOK 90-day course, and it has been recommended that oil, sugar, and white flour be eliminated, but the office hours often talk about using these ingredients, especially oils. Can you please explain? I am confused. Peggy, don't be confused. The ideal is to eliminate sugar, fat, salt, bleached ingredients like white flour. Okay. But that's difficult to do. If you're up to it, go for it. Many people are making the transition at a less intense level, and they're just decreasing those items rather than eliminating them. Okay, and so you get to find the balance that's going to work for you. But please don't be confused. Okay, it's all good in the end. Just choose the approach that's going to work for you. All right, thank you. Beans are a source of protein and fiber. With allergies to beans, what could be substituted? Is it all beans, like all pulses, all legumes? You can't eat any of them. In that case, then eat everything else in the plant world, which also provides lots of fiber. And remember that all plant foods provide amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks to protein. Okay. And that's going to be true of most beans anyway. All right. You need to be eating other things with them during the course of the day in order for your body to do its magic, right? The intelligence of your body will take you to the finish line. You just need to eat a varied diet in moderation, all right, in order to get what you need in terms of nutrients. All right. But beans or no beans, no problem. All right. Thank you. Next up, this may seem like a silly question, but it is never addressed. When mincing garlic through a press, there is a substantial amount of garlic left inside. I usually cut that up, include it in the dish. Is this a no-no? I'd say that's a yes, yes. Don't allow anything to go to waste. If you see that little bit of garlic in there, actually it's not a little bit, it's often a good bit, right? That gets caught up behind the screen. Yeah, by all means, pull it out, put your knife to it, and incorporate that into your dish. I think that's going to be a sign of the frugal cook, which is the wise cook. All right, thank you. Next up, I'm looking on Amazon for a large stainless steel mixing bowl, and it's a little overwhelming. I'm taking the FOK cooking class. Can you suggest a good size mixing bowl, 20 quart, 30 quart, etc., and a good brand to look for? Okay, so let me first say that 20 quart and 30 quart is gargantuan. Okay, if you're cooking for a big group of people, then that may well be the appropriate size for you. I mean, otherwise, here at home, I routinely use, maybe a 5 quart mixing bowl. I mean, we've got probably a couple, 3 of them, as needed. And then we've got many smaller ones. So 20 and 30 quart are big, but certainly not unheard of. That's usually restaurant work for me. But in terms of a brand, I don't know. Take a look at reviews, number one, to see what other customers have said about a given product. In terms of a gauge, right? The metal thickness or the gauge of the stainless steel. I would say at the very thinnest, you want to go with a 26 gauge stainless steel. And, so that's going to be considered a medium weight stainless steel bowl, and perhaps something even a little bit heavier than that. And if you look online, you will probably see some options, but I don't have any brand names that come to mind right now. Okay. And, but anyway, in terms of sizes, start with a 5 quart and then a couple of smaller sizes as well. Should be good for most home cooking. Thank you. Okay, next up from Tara. I'd love to hear you elaborate on the intro sentence about turning a passion for cooking into profit. Also, if you can pardon the pun, boil it down to a handful of keys to success as someone thought through their path forward. What would they be? Okay. So I'm going to just touch upon very briefly some of the things that I mentioned earlier in one of the very early questions about starting a food truck, right? Which is very similar to what I'm reading here, the idea of starting a business around food, where I think it's really important to develop your knowledge and skills around food handling, food experience in general, which means eating, to see how other people do it. It means doing it yourself to understand how ingredients and cooking methods do certain things together. It might mean traveling to understand the cultural context of food, which is very important. And then also to think about what it is you want to do as you turn your passion to profit. Do you want to cook? Do you want to teach? Do you want to write? Do food blogging, for example, or work for some other organization in the context of writing? Do you want to do food photography in some capacity or another? Do you want to engage in culinary tourism, or the other many ways that food can be professionalized and monetized, in some way? Okay, and then get some experience in that area on somebody else's dime. In other words, go work for somebody to understand how that aspect of the business is conducted. Very often there are some idiosyncrasies that an outsider wouldn't understand because it's not visible, it's not readily known. So it's not until you get into the organization that you begin to understand some of these small points, some of these little funny things that are part and parcel of doing business in that area of food. And then if it's your own business that you're thinking about, then you need a business plan. Craft a business plan, take some time, usually a few months, to fill in all the details, to investigate whether your idea is viable or not. And if some aspect of it is not viable, then how can I change my plan or find a solution that will help me progress down that path. Okay, and then give it a try. All right, thank you. Next up, thanks. Your answer was very clear. Balance is the answer. I'm no longer confused and actually a little relieved. Excellent, Peggy. I can sleep better tonight knowing that I've helped you and hopefully others out. All right, thank you. Next up, when wine is required for a recipe, is there a specific wine I should be using? I know some specifically ask for Madeira, but is this too sweet to use all the time? Okay, two very different questions here. The first one, when wines are called for generally, we're thinking about a dry red wine or a dry white wine. And so dry means no sugar, no residual sugar. Okay, so in other words, it's not a sweet wine, it's a dry wine. And in terms of wines to choose, there are a few wines out there, but very commonly we might choose something like a Merlot or a Cabernet Sauvignon as far as a dry red wine goes. Sauvignon Blanc, as far as a dry white wine, is very popular. Chardonnay is also very common in the kitchen. The good news is you can also sip on those while you're cooking. Now, if you're cooking desserts, then sometimes we call for a sweet white wine. All right. One of my favorite categories in terms of a grape is going to be a Riesling. So Rieslings are available in many different styles, from very, very sweet to a moderate sweetness. So you can pick your Riesling in the case of a dessert preparation. So that answers the first part of your duo here. And next up, regarding Madeira, I just want to very quickly mention that Madeira comes in a number of different styles, ranging from dry to sweet. Okay, so you could choose, a sweet or a dry version. All right, thank you. And next up from Jeffrey. Thanks again for answering our questions with patience and grace. Well, thank you very much for seeing me in that light. I appreciate it. Can you tell me the healthiest way to cook wheat gluten seitan? Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential here, right? Because seitan is kind of a canvas, right? And we can do a lot of things to it, starting with the herbs and spices that you might need, into or mix into the dough. You added those things to the flour, and then as we make that dough, we've got that flavor that's built in. And so that in itself can take seitan in many different directions in terms of global regional cuisine is concerned. Okay. And then from there, you've got a choice between the size, right, that you want to work with, whether it's a large loaf, whether it's smaller individual, maybe sausage shaped or sausage sized pieces, or whether they're even smaller than that, like individual dumplings. All right. And, we can serve it sauced, or we can serve it, stir fried in a more dry preparation. And so I'm giving you some very general, sort of high level responses here, but I think they provide a framework that allows you to play around quite a bit at each of those stages that I just mentioned to create a lot of variety in the dish that you might prepare. Okay, so I hope that helps you. Thank you. Next up, I signed up for the Pro course. I took the FOK several years ago and really enjoyed it. I was wondering if there is a Facebook page for Pro level only, or is it the same one from the FOK course? And so Patrick has just posted a link to the Plant-Based Pro course Facebook page. So do check that out and see if that does the trick for you. Thank you. And next up, since joining the course, I have gotten numerous ads on my Facebook feed for vegan food products. Are there any you recommend? Deborah, if we're talking about any of these sort of store-bought, maybe ready-made vegan products, whether it's a cheese or a snack item or something else, I don't buy any of those. And so, my experience is really thin in this area, and I really don't have any specific recommendations for you. Okay, thanks. All right, next up from Angela. All right, I want to thank all the chefs and instructors who help all of us in this course, the FOK course. I'm enjoying this program very much. I highly recommend this culinary class. It is informative, challenging, and very fun. Angela, thank you very much. I want to mention that we have a lean, mean chef instructor team here at Ruby. And, each one of us comes with a very different background from the next person. So collectively, we have a lot of experience, many, many years, many, many decades of experience. And that helps us, guide and encourage our students and also take on these questions, these numerous questions, these varieties and varieties of questions that we get from students that are challenging. And, we learn beside each of you too, with many of these questions. So I appreciate your engagement, and, to say that the course experience was informative, challenging, and very fun, I think is the biggest compliment right there. That's really what we want in our courses, right? And I think from a student standpoint, that's what you want as well. That's a perfect balance. Thanks so much for your comment. Next, as a fellow student who now owns a vegan restaurant, I would like to thank Ruby for providing the initial tools for a life in the culinary industry. I'd love to see more courses on working with seitan, fermentation techniques, in-depth cheese making. Well, thank you very much for your suggestions. And, we're happy to keep those in mind because from time to time, the occasion does arise for us to create a new course or a new module of some sort. And we always welcome your suggestions. Thank you. And let's see. So next up, they are selling coconut cream for whipping, okay, on Amazon. Have you used it before? And can I use it in the whipped cream dispenser? I have eaten it before. I got to say I didn't pay attention to it, so I don't have a whole lot to say about it. And I've certainly never used it in the dispenser, but give it a try. That's what I would have to do. All right. But yeah, give it a try and see how you like it. Thank you. All right. Next up, in many recipes, Ruby mentions 2 tablespoons butter. It's always a bit a problem for me to measure since the butter is not a liquid. What is the reason Ruby not mention butter as a weight or a size? What is the conversion from tablespoons to size or weight? All right, that's a fair question. And, I will say that, many of our recipes, certainly in those early stages, were written using volume measures. And we're slowly making a shift to incorporating weight or incorporating, metric measures. I think that's good practice on our part. Now, regarding handling butter, I'll give you a couple of bits of information here. A tablespoon of butter is very close to 14 grams in weight. Now, another way to handle butter is to melt it and then to incorporate it, and then to measure it and then to incorporate it as needed. But if you need it hard, cold, then about 14 grams per tablespoon is going to be the weight. Now, you can always take a look online as well. There are some conversions from U.S. measurements to metric, or from volume measures to weight that can help you out. All right, thank you. And next up from Bradley, why do you enjoy having a profession in the food industry? Well, I think for me, it lies at the intersection of food and people, that idea of hospitality. And there's really a lot, right, that goes into this question that you're asking. And, I'll try to answer it in a concise way here, by saying a few things. One, I like to eat. I always have ever since I was a little kid. I like the smell of food. I like the way it looks and sounds as it's being prepared. I'm intrigued buy foods as a consumer. I like to try new foods. I haven't found a food yet that I don't like, which makes traveling really easy for me. I like the challenge of preparing food. I also like, from the standpoint of hospitality, right, the idea of accommodating somebody. And sometimes it's super easy, and sometimes it's a challenge. And I welcome the challenge, right? If somebody says they don't like this, or they've their child has never enjoyed it this way, then guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to take that as a challenge to prepare something using that ingredient that they like, or to produce that item so that their child will enjoy it. And I've been pretty successful, thank goodness. I keep my fingers crossed here, with those sorts of challenges. As far as the restaurant business is concerned, the restaurant business is super challenging also. As a place to do business, at least in the U.S., and I know this to be true in other parts of the world. Number one, we're dealing with a finicky public, right, and a critical public. And so how do you please most of the people most of the time? It takes a lot of thought, a lot of planning, a lot of effort, a lot of testing, a lot of knowledge of food products and skills in order to create a menu, to create dishes or versions of dishes that will appeal to most people most of the time. And I'm thinking about 80% of the people. The 10% at either edge, I don't worry about them because I'll never satisfy them. But if I can, aim to meet the needs and wants of that middle 80% or so, I know that my restaurant will remain open. We also deal with a perishable inventory, which provides a really interesting challenge. It's not like a shoe store, right? It's not like I'm selling office supplies where I can take a vacation for a couple of weeks and come back and guess what? The shoes are still good. The erasers and staplers are still good. Not with food. And so you, on a daily basis, sometimes hour to hour, literally hour to hour, you got to keep, your pulse on the food, so to speak, and use it in a timely fashion. We've got, oftentimes a labor pool that is quite varied, and arguably more varied than many, many other industries, in terms of experience level, and in terms of education level, in terms of motor skills and other aptitudes. And so to work with this very diverse population as a mentor, as a trainer, is also very challenging. And there's so much more to it, but these are some things that all come together within the restaurant industry that certainly capture my interest and have kept me here for the last 2.5 decades or so. Thank you. Next up, let's see. Just received the knives that I ordered, and the difference is amazing. Excellent. You get a fresh set of knives. They fit your hand. And then, they're sharp, and it really makes kitchen work much more pleasant. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Next up, what is a good cooking method and recipe profile for a white veal chop? Okay. So this is a nice question here. A couple of things come to mind. And, one is to saute. This is going to be an easy one, okay, in terms of the cooking method. And, veal is pretty mild in flavor. And so it's nice to add some flavor to it. And, you might start off with, my preference anyway is pepper, some nice aromatic pepper, black pepper, with thyme or rosemary, a couple of herbs that I like. And then this can be sauteed, and just before adding it to the pan, salt it. That further brings out some of that flavor, and then saute it to your desired doneness, and develop some nice deep color, because that caramelization is going to add to the otherwise mild flavor right, of a veal chop. All right. Now, and then that in itself, right, gets you to a point of doneness that can be enjoyed. Now, another approach would then be to deglaze the pan with a little bit of stock, let that reduce till it's almost all sec. Just it's a little bit of moisture left in the pan. Maybe add some mushrooms if you like that sort of flavor profile, texture and all. And then, saute those, add some shallots, could be onions and garlic if you prefer. Build that up with some stock as needed, right? Once that moisture releases a bit from the mushrooms. If you prefer butter, you can add a little bit of butter to help that process along. And then you can finish that while there's a little bit of a reduced stock left in the pan with a little hit of heavy cream. Reduce that a bit to get those flavors to mingle, and you have a nice rich sauce to finish the chops with. Okay, so just a couple of avenues for some quick finishing. Thank you. All right, next up from Janet. What's the definition of finely chopped? Is that the same as a large dice? So let me start with the second part of your question here. A large dice, by most textbook and culinary school measurements, is a 3/4 inch dice. So 3/4 inches by 3/4 inches by 3/4 inches. It's specific, okay? Something that's chopped is going to be irregular in shape. It's not defined by a specific measurement. And if it's going to be finely chopped, it's going to be rather small in size. Okay, so something that's finely chopped is just a matter of taking your knife to it across the cutting board a few times until it's small enough for whatever application you have in front of you. Okay, thank you. And next up, my pro class starts officially 9/10. Does that mean I can only join the live events after that date? Nope, you can join the live events any old time you want. In fact, enjoy some of the archived versions as well. Okay, look forward to seeing you here. Thank you. Is there any plan to do a red seal preparation course? I think Ruby would be fabulous at it. Well, I'm not sure. I haven't had any discussion, her discussion yet of the red seal equivalent, but yeah, I'll introduce it to the gang here and see if there's anything else going on. Thank you. All right, let's see. Next up. Does Ruby have or will have more items as it pertains to garde manger, cheese pasteurization, and dairy? We would like to integrate more to Ruby content to match our curriculum. Thanks. Mark from Scottsdale Community College. Okay. So, at present, as you probably saw, right? So cheese pasteurization, and I'm going to read a little bit more into that and say perhaps cheese production, okay, as well as garde manger. Those areas we don't delve deeply into, okay, and so nothing's hiding. There's no current discussion to develop more content in those areas. But as I mentioned earlier, that can change, just depending on, on circumstances. And so it is certainly possible that we could tap into some deeper garde manger techniques. Okay. I appreciate the question. And again, I'll put it on the list of things to consider here. Thank you. All right, next up, some recipes call for sugar and salt. Would this cancel each other out in terms of taste or added depth? No, they don't cancel each other out. They can mingle with one another in some cases, depending on on the amounts of each. Right? they can sort of become more prominent, right, versus the other. Although, salt doesn't go away, right? If something's got a lot of salt, we can't. It's hard to balance salt, and sugar is a tough one as well. It's not like astringency or bitterness or sourness, which are more easily balanced. But they do not cancel each other out. Okay, thank you. How do you bloom spice in oil? So very basically, you get some oil, heat it up, and you want it to become fairly hot, right at the smoke point or just below the smoke point. And then you add your whole spices. They will often splatter and pop and jump about, so you might have a lid handy to place over those spices. And you just give those some seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds or so. You might want to decrease the heat a little bit at that point so the spices don't burn. And then that's going to be simultaneously drawing flavor out of those spices into the oil. And then very quickly, you'll move on to, removing that now flavored oil from the pan into whatever else that you're preparing. Or you can add something else to the pan. But the idea then is to cool down that product so it doesn't burn, okay? Because spices do burn pretty easily. Another way to do that is with powdered or ground spices, in which case use an oil temperature which is a little bit lower because there's more surface area and it'll burn faster, okay? And then similar process, you just let those flavors pull out of the spices into the oil, and then you can use that medium to flavor other things. All right, thank you. Next up, and let's see here. How do different materials of cookware influence the taste? So some chefs advocate for using only copper cookware. Others use cookware made of different materials. Which one is best in your opinion? Agreed. There are folks out there that split hairs over a lot of things, and I'm not one of those people. I can cook good food in a lot of different cookware, and I would like to see each of you get to that point, okay, in developing your skills and your food handling knowledge, so that given any sort of a pan, you're going to prepare some tasty food, and it's going to be done properly with solid methodology, good technique, and good know-how to back all of that up, okay? I've certainly used a lot of different materials of cookware. We have many in our kitchen right now. I don't have a preference from a flavor standpoint, basically. If anything, it has to do with maintenance of the pan, where stainless steel is pretty easy. Cast iron is pretty easy, but takes a little bit more care to maintain seasoning or to build up seasoning, to re-season from time to time. When it comes to copper, I've got some tin-lined copper. Tin wears off after a period of time. It requires re-tinning. There is newer technology with stainless steel bonded to the copper. It has the heating benefits of copper, the heat distribution benefits with the maintenance benefits of stainless steel. I'm not sure if you're getting any flavor benefit from the copper at that point. A lot of variables there, but I don't get too caught up in all that stuff. I just cook, right? And I encourage you to do the same. Thank you. All right, next up. Could Ruby please add a link to CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, notices so we can watch product recalls for food safety? Let me take that into consideration with the gang here, Trish. I appreciate your comment here. Thank you. Which books about cooking could you recommend? Not recipe books, but rather about the food itself or techniques like FE technique of, okay, Jacques Pepin, or salt, fat, acid, heat, mastering the elements of good cooking. Okay. I got to say, I have not been to the book section of the book, of the cooking section of a bookstore in a long time, nor have I looked for books like this online. So I don't have any particular books that sort of roll off my tongue, in terms of techniques. Yeah, take a look online, look for consumer reviews and see what's trending. I guess that's maybe the first thing I would say. Otherwise, if you were to grab a professional culinary textbook, such as on cooking or professional cooking, a couple of common examples used in culinary schools in the United States anyway. That's all you need. If you understand those cooking methods and secondary techniques and practice with those recipes, then you're going to have a super solid foundation for cooking a lot of different foods. And then beyond that, if you drill down into particular regional cuisines where you have techniques that are unique to that cuisine, then you'll need an additional book to look at Japanese cuisine, for example. Okay, in which case the Tsuji has a nice book of probably 30 years ago that looks at basic Japanese methods and techniques. But otherwise, just take a look at any solid culinary textbook and get to know that content, and that's really going to get you to the finish line. All right, thank you. And next up, is there a particular dehydrator that you would recommend? Generally speaking, design-wise, if you look for a dehydrator that's got a fan at the back of the unit so that the airflow is fairly even coming across all of the trays, then that tends to be most desirable, okay? Otherwise, the other design is to have a fan at the base, in which case the trays at the bottom have more exposure to that movement of air and the heat, and they dry faster. So you'll need to rotate the trays in order to even out the results. So just generally speaking, a fan at the back of the box tends to be the preferred design. And there are Excalibur, and there are some other brands that fit that bill. Okay, but again, take a look online at consumer reviews to get an idea of what people are saying out there about those products. Thank you very much. Okay, and just like that, we're out of questions today, and we're at the end of my office hours. I want to thank each of you for joining me today, whether you came in from the first minute or if you joined midstream. I hope that you benefited in some fashion today from the topics that we talked about. And I look forward to you next time during my office hours. Until then, enjoy cooking. Thank you very much. Bye now.